Patriotism. In the 21st century, it's an idea that we are accustomed to. The idea of pride and devotion to our country of birth is a well established phenomenon that continues to be debated and discussed, both in terms of how it influences our interpretation of our nation's history and the way in which it impacts upon modern political discussion. But what happens in a world where the idea of what your nation is and what it stands for is in flux? That was the case in the early 19th century, when all nations were still trying to decide, first of all, where their borders lay, what they stood for, and how to describe themselves. Your initial reaction might be to see what the men of the period were saying, the politicians, the soldiers, the individuals with the vote. How were they talking about their nation and what they believed in? But while we've often examined the male perspective, the ways in which women demonstrated patriotic fervour has been pushed to the sidelines. Tonight, in the first instalment of a two-part exploration of the topic, we dive deep into the embryonic patriotism of the British nation at a time when it was still getting used to, and was unconvinced by, the idea of being a united kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. We discuss the ways in which women were allowed to express views on politics and patriotism, the dangers of being too politically expressive, and the women whose letters give us a window into this knotty problem, opening up a perspective that has so far received less focus than it deserves. This is Britain, Patriotism and Women in the Napoleonic Wars. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleonic Wars podcast with me, the newly crowned librarian, the keeper of the books, the quartermaster, Liam Telfer. And as always, with me today is Dr. Zach White, Cher Emperor. Terrible accent, but there we are. I wouldn't be wearing a red coat if I could speak French. How are you, Zach?
I'm all right, mate, although I am slightly concerned by this habit that you've acquired, presumably from Luke's kind of malign influence of just acquiring titles at will. It's a little bit too sort of Bonaparte-esque for my liking. I'm concerned that you're going to sort of next declare yourself sort of deputy scholar in residence and, I don't know, deputy emperor of the Napoleonic Wars pod and of the Napoleonicist patrons and all the rest of it. So we need to sort of make sure you're reined in, man.
Well, similar to the Marshallet, I think, if I do well in an episode, I should be given, due reward and maybe a new title, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, you've got letters after your name, and maybe I'm coming for them.
I mean, you're more than welcome to come for them because, frankly, I think a lot of people see the letters after my name and go, "How the heck did he manage to hoodwink somebody into garnering those?" But this kind of "I want all the shiny things" stuff basically smacks to me of you wanting to expand your range of merchandise of hoodies that declare your various titles, and so you basically want sort of the prince of the Napoleonic Library as some kind of thing emblazoned across the back of your hoodie.
I mean, to be fair, I hadn't come up with that, but that is a good one. Yeah, yeah. I'm going to have several hats, t-shirts, and hoodies with various accolades on them.
At the risk of being sort of the voice of reason and common sense, which is never my role on this podcast, shall we actually get down to business for today's episode before our guest thinks we've completely lost the plot?
I mean, to be honest, I'm surprised she's actually still here with us. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Emma Macleod is a senior lecturer in history at the University of Stirling, where she has taught for many years. She is the author of A War of Ideas, British Attitudes to the Wars Against Revolutionary France, and that is with Routledge Revivals. How are you, Emma?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very, very welcome. And if you are happy, we would very much like to crack on with the first question before I get told off by Zach again.
Absolutely.
Right. So as always, I love a good scene setter. And at the risk of asking an exceptionally broad question that could probably, lead to a whole series of podcasts, where are we in the development of patriotism and nationalistic identity in the late 18th and early 19th centuries?
Great, that is a huge question. Can I split that into two bits, the patriotism and nationalistic identity? Is that all right? So
Absolutely.
you can interrupt me or stop me if you think I'm going on too long. So if I start with patriot, it's in really common usage in the period, but I don't think there was one universally accepted definition of it. Probably three main definitions. So for most of the 18th century, patriotism really simply meant defence of the national interest, and that could well mean holding a government to account as opposed to my country right or wrong. Actually quite oppositional, and the country connection in Parliament tended to see themselves in that kind of tradition of patriotism. And that expanded during the period of the American Revolutionary War into something quite cosmopolitan. So actually almost the reverse of what we tend to think now of nationalism. So as the language of natural rights emerged, universal natural rights, in which the love of one's country was not at the expense of any other people, but promoted the rights of humanity quite widely. And you can see how that was developed both in the American and the French revolutions with declarations of the rights of men, the citizen, and so on. So still quite oppositional, actually, that form of patriotism. However, from the 1790s, the word is hijacked by the conservative side of politics in Britain, the loyalists, in support of the British government against revolutionary France. And the association of those who admired the revolution in France to any extent, even the relatively moderate liberals in Parliament, was tarred as being well-nigh treacherous. So very difficult then if you are supporting the people who become the enemy of your government to cling on to that word patriot. They tried pretty hard to do that, but it becomes much more difficult for them to do that. So the context there is something I think is really interesting about the period is British politics crystallizing over the course of the period, probably not really until after the death of Pitt and Fox in 1806, but really crystallizing into two oppositional parties. So they're both trying to lay claim to this term patriot through the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. I think it's fascinating how Charles James Fox and his acolytes in Parliament, while they appear not to be particularly successful politically through the period, actually, I think their big achievement, aside from eventually getting through the abolition of the slave trade, which is huge, but the big achievement domestically, I think, is to establish the acceptability of a loyal opposition, which could be held to be patriotic, even although it wasn't always supporting, in fact, very rarely supporting the government very much. Does that make sense?
It does, but immediately I'm kind of thinking, okay, so there's a contested, it's a contested sort of definition of what is a patriot, and I'm very interested in this idea of sort of the right claiming
Mm.
the idea of patriotism, and sort of the language around it. And I know that at this stage we still need to talk about national identity, but we'll get there. But I'm just curious about how the term loyalist feeds
Mhm.
into this as well, particularly within the context of the American Revolution, where the idea of whether or not America is a nation in its own right, even though it may proclaim itself so, where does that recognition comes from? At that point, suddenly how those living in America define themselves becomes really kind of difficult, and again would be one of those situations where both sides
Yeah.
could argue that they are being the patriots either to their newly formed fledgling nation or to the metropole, if you like, to Britain. So how does all of that play out, and is there a sense that within the context, and I'm guessing at this, but within the context of the American Revolution, does patriot become something of a sort of dirty word almost because it's mired in so much conflict?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. So no, that's really interesting to take it back to that war, because the rebelling colonists called themselves, obviously not rebellious colonists, but patriots. It's a much more attractive term. And the pro-British side in America were the loyalists. That's absolutely right. I don't think the terms are used in quite that way by people in Britain about themselves or about others. There are people, there are kind of small L loyalists in Britain who support the line the British government is taking with the American revolutionaries, and they are loyal to the government. Again, I think that those who are critical of the government, who are oppositional, would still claim that they were small p patriots, that again, they're holding the government to account, they're defending the interests of their country and trying to tell the government that they're taking a catastrophic line and they ought to stop and change direction. So I think the terms are perhaps not so contested inside Britain. But that's really interesting. I can't recall a discussion. There will have been one. I don't know it though. A discussion in Britain of the American patriots taking up of that term to describe themselves. So that is something I would like to know more about, and I can't tell you any more about that. But it's a great question. But it just shows how it's the kind of term that everybody wants. Everybody is basically well disposed towards their own country. It's kind of ridiculous to suggest that the vast majority of people are not, and therefore they all want to point this out. But equally, particularly during a time of war, that can be quite difficult to defend, and it's very easy for people who are supportive of a government's line during the war to say, look, you're behaving like fifth columnists. This is not a time to be critical of the government. This is a time to back the government. And indeed, certainly during the French Revolutionary Wars, a lot of people who had previously been in opposition absolutely agreed with that line and switched to support the government. I'm trying to think whether that happened. I don't think it did happen during the time of the American Revolution. It is much more a civil war on both sides of the Atlantic.
And just looking at the second part of that question, in terms of that nationalistic identity, does conflict accelerate that? You know, you talk about, the patriots established themselves as the patriots, and, not necessarily specifically, obviously in that case it is, but not necessarily specifically during the American Revolutionary War. But is conflict going to accelerate the establishment of a nationalistic identity, do you think?
Yeah, I think it did. I'm really glad that you used the word identity. I really struggle with the term nationalism of Britain in this period. I don't think it works because we are not aggressively campaigning for self-determination because we already had it. But I think identity is a really important word, but it's also a really difficult word because it is complex and nobody has just one identity. Most individuals have many identities, never mind a country. So I think that's right. I actually think the American Revolutionary War did the same job because effectively a really significant part of the British Empire was lopping itself off from that empire, was maturing and deciding to secede and to form eventually its own nation state. And then the British Empire changed quite considerably. So the movement towards the empire in the East had already begun, of course, but the British emphasis and focus on the East, particularly India, became so much more concentrated after America had seceded. So actually, I think we could say that British identity does change and has to change because America had been so important to how the British had seen themselves during the 18th century. When that's no longer there, something else has to give. Also, if you see the conception of one's own identity as being dependent to some extent on what you're not and who the other is, if we use that terminology, then war absolutely underlines that in bold and highlights it in bright yellow, doesn't it? So then there is a sense of almost exaggerated polarization during wartime and an exaggerated intolerance of qualities and characteristics and features that we see not to be identified with us. So typically Frenchness, Catholicism, and absolutism and so on. So yes, I think war is really important there. Then there's also the flip side of that, which is, well, what are the features that make us particularly British? So the whole movement towards Four Nations history over the last 4 or 5 decades. Linda Colley's book on Britons, which was so seminal in 1992, The Forging of the Nation, and what she describes helpfully, I think, as this sort of superimposing of a British identity on top of all kinds of other identities that people already had. Not arguing that it was kind of sweeping Scottishness or Cornishness or Yorkshireness or whatever away, but the Britishness is kind of built on top of that. And again, I think war does accelerate that, and I think there are various points that she makes in that book which are difficult to argue with. So you guys know more about this than I do, but the traveling and fighting together of soldiers from different parts of the country, and the feeling that there was more in common there than there was that divided them, that kind of thing. It's problematic because what do you do with Ireland in terms of her thesis? There are various kinds of problems. There have been other scholars who have pointed out other things that helped British people to think about what it meant to be British. So are we thinking about class? Are we thinking about gender? What do we do with Scotland, Wales, and Ireland? Is Britishness essentially a kind of super Englishness, or does it actually embed Scottishness, Welshness, Irishness, different regions of Englishness in there? And then we're back to the empire again and the new imperial identity and Britain's sense of itself at the end of the 18th century, the turn of the 19th century, a kind of general sense of superiority. But it's also a really interesting moment for self-questioning because we've just lost America and we've got this flood tide of people saying, actually, what we're doing with people from Africa is not good, and we actually need to stop doing this. So that there's a kind of real questioning, I think, at this point in time, as well as a sense that probably we know best. Does that help?
It does, and it's got my brain popping in various different directions in a way that probably hasn't happened quite as much as this in quite some time in one of these interviews. There are two things that spring to mind here. One is one of my sort of favorite things to talk about these days, given the route that my research has gone in, which is martial race theory. Um, but particularly with an eye towards what you're saying there about the Scottish, the Irish to an extent as well, and sort of this construction of identities and the way in which they can sort of be embedded into this sort of bigger inverted commas whole of Britishness. And I'm just really curious about what your take is on the way in which that notion of martial race theory kind of is a solution to this idea that you might come from different parts of the three kingdoms, four kingdoms rather. My apologies. But in in the process of your contribution that the commentators during this period are saying, this is an automatic thing that, you were born to do because and raised to do because of the nature of the landscape that you've grown up in. Is that a way of getting around the problem of difference by kind of saying, well, actually, you're just sort of fulfilling a role that you're particularly designed for in the interests of this bigger kind of idea of a unified nation?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting way of looking at it. So if we think about Scottish Highlanders, and they were absolutely seen as a martial race within a martial race, right? And sort of in the vanguard of all of that. Actually, in many ways, that's a solution to the problem of what we do with tracts of land on which there are lots of people, but we would rather have that land for sheep because they're not as difficult to deal with as people, and we can make some money out of them. And actually, we just need to move people off the land. And if we tell them that they are particularly good at fighting, then this is a way of moving Scottish Highlanders far out of proportion to the number of the population, and changing the balance of the population across Scotland and the UK as it became by moving people into the army, or indeed eventually emigrating lots of people. So there is no evidence, I think, that Scottish Highlanders were a particularly martial race any more than anybody else. Sure, they were used to fighting border territory disputes and so on. But really, this is about how you manage people. And there's such interesting work done on that by folk like Andrew MacKillop, but also more lately people like Nicola Martin, looking at how the British manage the Highlands after Culloden, how they go on to apply those lessons in North America vis-a-vis the indigenous peoples. There, Geoffrey Plank, in fact, is there first, and Nicola has developed that by looking at Lord Loudon and what he does, having tried to manage people in the Scottish Highlands less abrasively, let's say, than other Hanoverian generals, and trying to do the same thing in North America. But all of this is using the notion of particular martial qualities in Highlanders for a particular purpose, rather than because of any intrinsic martial qualities. But really interesting to think about that also from the point of view of the Four Nations, for sure. And you can see that working in Ireland as well, because of the disproportionate numbers of Irishmen in the army by the end of the 18th century, in the British Army by the end of the 18th century, once various penal restrictions have been removed from Catholics there. So yeah, very similar. And then you can say, oh, this is wonderful because it's part of knitting together the British peoples.
Apologies, I'm going to continue with the rabbit holes. As Liam would say, this is a warren, not a hole. But what you're talking about there is a sort of kind of a top-down kind of implementation, or at least from what I'm hearing of what you're saying. This is an idea that is being pushed down onto the people to sort of artificially forge this idea of Britishness. But I'm also curious about what's going on from the bottom up.
Yep.
At a grassroots level. And I'm very struck with the way in which I've encountered this, looking at how the British talk about themselves in relation to going to war with the French, particularly soldiers, and this sense of one-upmanship, that the simple fact that they are British, not that they really seem to be able to define what being British means, but because they are British, that therefore means they are better, which means they're better than the French. And this is a trope that they do draw on, and on a number of occasions in memoirs. Now, sure, memoirs produced in hindsight, there's a lot to sort of unpick there, but I'm just very curious about the language that seems to be sort of automatically reached for in that regard, and what you see through your research of what is happening at a grassroots level that either feeds into that or contradicts that.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I think you're absolutely right. I definitely see that. And two things immediately spring to mind in terms of how that is typically justified in writing from very sort of crude, simple publications for very mass distribution, but also in images, right through to more sophisticated material. But the two things are British liberty, by which is broadly meant the fact that we don't live in a despotic absolute monarchy, but we have a parliamentary constitution in which we have a Bill of Rights and we have various safeguards against all kinds of things that are undesirable, the sort of freedom from torture, the right to life, liberty, and property, the protection of not to be held against one's will without trial for longer than a certain period of time, all that kind of thing. So British liberties being represented in Parliament, in the House of Commons, which is one of the tripartite elements of the Constitution, the King, Lords and Commons, that is very often referred to the blessings of the British Constitution, and how blessed people are to live as happy Britons under this kind of constitution that guarantees people's rights and liberties, and prevents people from being overtaxed because all taxes have got to be agreed by Parliament. And then on the other hand, the other thing is Protestantism. And again, that together with the kind of constitutionalism, I think is how most people would explain that we are better than France or Spain or whoever we happen to be fighting. And it goes further very often in pamphlets about the war, or whatever war we happen to be fighting, the Catholics in, because very often Britain is referred to as the new Israel of God, the favoured nation. And the reason that there are so many fast days and days of Thanksgiving proclaimed and honoured up and down the country is a reliance on the fact that actually God is particularly interested in Britain. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because we are particularly blessed. We're blessed with this constitution. We're blessed with this expanding empire. We're blessed with ever increasing prosperity through the 18th century. And therefore, this is evidence that God is particularly in favour of Britain. And I think once you've got those two concepts under your belt, then there is a sense that you have the wind behind your sails and you are going to be better than the French, and there's a pretty decent chance we're going to beat them.
It reminds me of the jokes by Al Murray about sort of God being British and how do we know that God is British and all the rest of it. And it sort of strikes me that that's kind of it's although that obviously that's a sort of taking a dig at a certain sort of mentality. Actually, that isn't too far away from what
No,
some folks are kind of thinking during this
no,
period.
and well, it's not just some folks. So again, this is enacted at the highest levels. If you look at the order of service that is published at Westminster for a day of Thanksgiving, I'm thinking of a particular one in 1797 after Duncan wins at Camperdown. And the king goes to St. Paul's Cathedral to offer thanks on the same day as his subjects up and down the country are going to church to offer thanks. He is taking with him the flags of Britain's enemies to lay at the high altar in St. Paul's. And it says in the margin, just as King David laid the trophies of the Philistines not at the temple, because there was no temple in those days, but before the altar of God. In the city of David. So there's that is printed on the margin of the order of service that goes out around the country. So it's very explicit from the top. This is not just some sort of ignorant plebeian type attitude.
It's a good job I am physically fit because at this point I am sprinting after Zach and Emma. Torch in hand, they are so far down underground in the rabbit warren. I think Zach should now be known as king of the rabbits.
I thought you were going to go a lot ruder with that. I thought you were going to say like king of the underworld. I thought you were going to like cast me as that goblin king out of The Hobbit. Like that's where my mind, which obviously says a lot about my my hobbies and research, my life beyond research. But okay, I'm not sure if I want King of the Rabbits. Although rabbits, sorry, we've gone down a rabbit hole about rabbits here. Rabbits and Napoleon do not get on well, so that would be consistent.
I mean, you're so far down this. It's fascinating stuff, and I know our listeners will love it. But you're so far down this rabbit warren. You're having tea with the Mad Hatter at this point.
I am the Mad Hatter. What are you on about?
Emma, I want to bring you back to your work, Thinking Minds of Both Sexes, and just sort of, again, set the scene a little bit. You use the term British blue stockings, and I wonder if you can explain kind of what a blue stocking is, and perhaps sort of where that term comes from.
Sure, thank you. So it really came from a small group of wealthy women who developed a sort of intellectual sociability from the middle of the 18th century, hosting salons in their London homes to discuss learning and scholarship in various fields. I'm just using the word British there, not because there's any kind of club, capital B, but just to distinguish them from the French salons from which they were inspired. And that's maybe a useful place to point out that there is this original core of friends, which is expanded over the decades as they correspond with each other, as they add correspondence, as people are invited to join as guests. But I think it's also acquired a sense of simply an intellectual woman. So one of the women that I discussed particularly in this piece is Anna Seward, the poet, and she's not part of the circle around Elizabeth Montagu, Elizabeth Carter, Elizabeth Vesey, not just because her first name wasn't Elizabeth, but she just wasn't part of that circle. She lived in Lichfield all her life, and really left it. So I think it has become a term that's used much more loosely than the people who were the original blue stocking circle, let's say, to mean an intellectual woman. Why are they called blue stockings? This is somewhat lost in the mists of time, but it seems to have something to do with the more informal blue worsted stockings that men wore when they weren't going to court occasions in their black silks. So my students love it when I say it's the equivalent of turning up in jeans instead of in your best dress. So when we do a salon, they all come in their jeans because they want to say this is us being blue stockings. I think actually it was originally a term of abuse. In the mid-17th century, applied to members of Cromwell's Barebones Parliament. I couldn't tell you any more than that, but I think that's where it originally came from. But then it's taken up and it has attracted this much more benign connotation now. Sometimes Archbishop Stillingfleet, Benjamin Stillingfleet, the botanist, who was, a welcome guest in Mrs. Montagu's house at these salons, sometimes associated particularly with him and his blue stockings. But other men were invited to join. So the blue stockings are women, but they have people like Samuel Johnson, James Boswell, Stillingfleet, obviously, and others, David Garrick, the actor. So that, I think, is probably what I want to say. They're an important source of patronage for less wealthy women. They are not typical people. They are wealthy, although a lot of them make their own living from their own writing. Elizabeth Montagu was independently wealthy, but not all of them were. But they are good at helping women who come from a lower rank in the social order whom they perceive to be talented. It could be a bit Lady Bountiful sometimes, but really important. Elizabeth Montagu's sister, Sarah Scott, who's an historian and novelist, she really is quite important in the bringing on of Phillis Wheatley, the Black poetess, by supporting her financially and giving her connections.
So, having received my ear bashing from Liam, we will press on we'll maintain some momentum on the interview rather than diving down more rabbit holes. because I'm getting that look from Liam that says, do your job, man. So to focus on your article, you particularly look at Anna Seward and Elizabeth Carter. I just want to get a little bit more of a sense of their lives and also what you can say about their political leanings at the beginning of the journey that they're going to go on.
Sure, thanks. So I think what's really interesting about both of them is that they were really both renowned, highly renowned as individuals. It didn't really matter, they were women. Elizabeth Carter is this fabulous Greek scholar, ancient Greek scholar, and Seward the poet. But both of them wrote when time allowed because they were genteel women. They had all kinds of other things that it was presumed that they would do in terms of household management and hospitality and so on. So rather than anybody presuming that because they were who they were, other people would fulfill those functions for them and they would have time to do a day's work every day on their writing. It didn't work like that for either of them. Anyway, Carter was a poet as well as being a Greek scholar. She had a large number of languages. She worked brutally long hours, famously brutally long hours. She paid somebody to wake her up every morning, and she had all kinds of methods of keeping herself up at night so that she could maximize her hours of study, lots of languages as well as other subjects. She's the daughter of a curate who educated all his children to a very high level, daughters as well as sons. Similarly, Anna Seward is the daughter of a rector who recognised her talents very early on and encouraged her in her writing. She was reading Shakespeare, Milton, and Pope by the age of 3. She had the first 3 books of Paradise Lost off by heart by the time she was 9. So they both clearly had a lot of natural talent, but also had a lot of encouragement from home, as well as always having to work with what was expected of a woman of their class at that time. In terms of their politics, they're a bit different. So, as I say, both genteel women, so neither of them is radical reformist. Both of them are fairly establishment, but Carter's default position is pretty conservative and to support the government, whereas Anna Seward would be much more like somebody who supported Charles James Fox in the House of Commons. So she would tend towards that kind of oppositional patriotism that we mentioned earlier.
Rabbit hole incoming. Not even worried what Liam's face is doing at this stage. This is a superficial point of comparison. I'm acutely aware of that. But if listeners who know much about the Brontes will perhaps see some similarities there. Fathers in a religious kind of clergy orientated setting. You've got these very clearly very talented women struggling to juggle writing with what is expected of them. And so it just makes me curious about what publishing prospects exist for these women, thinking about the Brontes and the well-known struggle that they have, their need to pretend to be men in order to sidestep the knee-jerk, frankly, misogyny that sort of wrapped around perceptions of what women should be writing and whether women should be writing. So I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit more on kind of how these women have to navigate the standards of their time in order to get published.
So that is a really interesting question. It's absolutely right. And I can think, for instance, also of Jane Austen. So even just to stay right within the period and the difficulty that she had. And what's common to all of them, I think, is the need to be backed by men if they're going to get published. And so actually Carter starts being published as a poet rather than as a Greek scholar. And that happens because the owner of the Gentleman's Magazine, Edward Cave, is a friend of her dad's. So she gets poems published there. But but they're good. So she gets published. And that is how she becomes known as a published scholar. And once she publishes her huge work, which is her translation of, I will get the pronunciation of this wrong, but Epictetus, that's huge. And it's recognized as being huge. Immediately, it goes through 5 editions during her lifetime. And that is what gives her financial independence. So that is not a struggle to be published, so far as I know, although I'm happy to be challenged on that. I think her friends recognize her to be a bit of a prodigy as far as Greek is concerned, and she is encouraged to do this. And it's men as well as women, and there we've got the entry into publishing, and the same with Anna Seward. It just means that not just having men on your side, but having men in publishing on your side. Presumably, if your father is in the ministry and knows how to be published, because they're all at it publishing sermons, then they've got some clue as to how you might go about getting started. But it is striking that both of them had very significant success with their names under their works. They didn't have to be pseudonymous, perhaps because they're not publishing novels, which are just a little bit risky, and we're not quite sure what we think about novel writing yet. At this, poetry is kind of safer for women, perhaps.
It's funny, in the background to these interviews, Liam and I are constantly texting about follow-up questions and other avenues. And one of the things that we were both discussing as you were saying this, and before you quite got there, was this kind of commonality of having fathers in the clergy. And I just wonder whether there's sort of any assumption of sort of having a backing of having come from a family that society would have deemed as highly respectable. You know, your father has this role within society, clearly a leading figure within the local community. You're clearly going to be very well educated in terms of the Bible and everything that entails. And does that perhaps give, I don't want to say sort of security, because I don't think it does give these women greater security. But does it lend them something in terms of respectability, perhaps, that gives them just that slight edge in terms of being regarded on merit, i.e., there isn't an assumption of, these women haven't been educated properly, because actually to do so would be to insult the man who has educated them, and the man is a very prominent figure in the local community.
Yeah, I couldn't give you any evidence that that's so, but I think that sounds really plausible. What I do think is really interesting about the same commonality, and that I can evidence a little bit more, is one might have presumed that establishment church ministers might have felt that women were a bit second class in terms of education, but apparently not in terms of lots of them. And so if I turn round perhaps a little bit what you're suggesting, perhaps clergymen have got the capacity to give their daughters a really decent education. So I'm thinking about one of my main projects just now is co-editing a brilliant series of letters between a Church of Scotland minister called James Woodrow in the second half of the 18th century into the 19th century, and his great friend, the Unitarian banker in Worcestershire, Samuel Kenrick. So I'm doing that with Anthony Page and Martin Fitzpatrick. And James Woodrow is fascinating. He's got 4 children, 2 boys and then 2 girls. The older girl has, I'm pretty sure, what we would describe as dyslexia now. But he is really defensive of her. He's absolutely certain she's just as bright as her sister. It's very annoying that her little sister is so much quicker than her in terms of picking up language, because she hasn't got this impediment. Nell cannot spell to save her heart, he says, but he knows she's a bright girl. And he takes great pains to educate his daughters, not in the same way that he educated his sons, because he didn't send them off to school. But they're well educated, and Nell Woodrow can go down to spend nearly a year with the Kenricks in Worcestershire without really a real worry about her being able to hold her end up in that kind of society. So I wonder, actually, I'm sure you're right that it does give them a respectability if you need anything to kind of put a finger in the balance as to whether somebody's going to be published or not. I'm sure it does. Certainly, it's just maybe connections, dad's connections. But I think they also do stand a particularly good chance of getting a decent education.
I think that, I mean, there's got to be something in that, and you're absolutely right. And I love that point that Zach made about the respectability. Although, like you say, there's not necessarily any evidence for it, but I certainly think these local communities, like, rural communities, in Austen's case, in the Brontes case, for example, yeah, their dad is going to be someone that everyone looks up to, and I guess by proxy, their daughters. I want to sort of go back a step and forward a step at the same time. You sort of touched on some of the sort of forms of patriotism earlier. And I'd love to deep dive that from the gender perspective. And, were those forms of patriotism open to women during the wars of the late 18th century? And sort of then how did that manifest itself going forward?
Yep, good, thanks. So, yeah, there were, absolutely. And I think just as the government and the governing elite, let's say, not just the government, but the governing classes had to embrace the rallying of support from classes of men that they might have preferred not to have politicized, in the kind of pre-totalizing type of war that you've got in the 1790s, and particularly in the early 1800s. So actually they needed the support of women as well, because they needed money. And women are another source of raising funds. So women could show their patriotism by doing things that it was deemed acceptable for women to do in support of a war effort. So I know that you get into discussing camp followers and army wives on the podcast, and the occasional cross-dressing woman soldier or sailor as well. But also for people on the home front, there are things that women could do, important contributions, essential contributions, which actually are so essential and so obvious that they tend not to be discussed either by us or by contemporaries, but a woman keeping the family economy going while husband, brother, father is off fighting the war. We make a huge deal of women doing this during the First World War. We never talk about it in the 1790s and the early 1800s, but it is there. It's not new in the First World War. It's presumably been done since the dawn of warfare. So keeping the family economy going in the absence of male relatives, charitable donations, that's a thing. The government appreciates that. Sewing, the socks and banners and so on, if they're particularly wealthy or particularly well connected, dispensing patronage also. Then there's more performative patriotism, signing the loyalist addresses, wearing cockades and other fashion items and so on in support of a regiment or a political party. I'm really interested in the fact that, again, particularly as we move into the French wars, away from the American wars, into the French wars and the Napoleonic wars, women are writing things for publication in support of the war. So that might be, again, done through a particularly feminine lens of things that it was accepted were appropriate for women to write. So poetry, or moralizing or religious heavy material. But you have people who move right to the extreme, people like Mary Wollstonecraft, Catherine Macaulay, writing straight politics as well, Helen Maria Williams, and then to counter them, Hannah More on the other side. I think there's a recognition that war directly affects women. And again, particularly in this war straddling the cusp of the 19th century, when you have such a high proportion of men in uniform one way or another, whether in the volunteers or whether as far away as possible in the world, fighting in India or wherever they end up being, such a high proportion of men in uniform, then it inevitably affects a very high proportion of women. But then you've also got taxation, you've got rising prices, you've got the very obvious defences in coastal towns, you've got army garrisons, and so on, and soldiers getting involved in keeping the peace also. So war directly affects women, and I think that is accepted. And then you've got this kind of symbolic Mrs. Bull in Britannia, who wheeled out probably more in wartime than in peacetime. And, you know, for all I want to suggest was maybe unique to the blue stocking type of women, they're involved in all these types of female patriotism as well.
So you will not be pleased to hear that I have 4 follow-up questions in relation to all of what you've said there.
Delighted.
Folks, we do try and manage these interviews, but I think it's an indication of the richness of this discussion that we are now 50 minutes into this interview, and we are not halfway through or even close to done. So what we are going to do is we are going to create a part 2 to this discussion, because there's no way we're rushing through the next 5 questions and trying to condense them into 20 odd minutes just for the sake of some arbitrary timestamp. So what we will do is just Liam at this point has had to cave. He's rolling his eyes so hard that he might give himself glaucoma if he's not careful. But we're just going to rabbit hole in a whole series of points, because I think what we're ending up doing here is really deep diving in an incredibly valuable way into the way in which women can express themselves politically, the pushback that they receive. And I think this is the point of a podcast like this, is to take a topic and really kind of pull apart the nuts and bolts. So that's what we're going to do. So an easy one to start with in terms of the follow-up is what you referred to there as Mrs. Bull. And I'm just curious about the representation of, inverted commas, Mrs. Bull. I'm very familiar with the representation of John Bull through caricature, particularly, you know, sort of very portly chap who, you know, sort of loves to, I don't know, eat French frigates, as one caricature sort of crafts him, or whatever it might be, frigases, he calls them. Curious kind of thing going on there in terms of, you know, the speech as well, and is that dialect, or quite what is it?
Yeah.
But Mrs. Bull, how is she depicted? How is she crafted? How does that clash as well with Britannia, or don't we have a Britannia at this point? Is that sort of a creation of later into the 19th century?
No, we absolutely have Britannia right through the 18th century, and she's quite well developed by the 1790s, and she makes appearances in some really well-known prints, actually. So I'm thinking of one called, get this right, British Liberty, French Liberty, where she is depicted. She has weapons. She has a helmet. She has a spear. She has a shield with a Union Jack on it. But they're clearly decorative. She's not actually expected to use them in anger. And very often she's got a British lion lying at her feet. And in this particular print, there is a man of war in the bay in front of her and defending her. So she is not going to fight herself. She's going to be fought for, but nonetheless, she has the symbolic weapons of war. And she is there established, I think, before Mariana. But they would be the opposing heads, I suppose. Mrs. Bull, I suppose, tellingly, really is very much in the shadows of her husband. She is much less commonly represented. She's there if we need a female foil to John Bull, if we need to bring in a second Bull voice. Occasionally you get Bull children as well. But she's really just there, I think, to add a little colour. If she's represented in images at all, which I think is not common, the kind of features you already mentioned, the kind of shape of figure would be very similar. And she would be in a very traditional wife role, backing her husband up, and certainly not more clever than him.
Fascinating. Again, temptations to dive in various directions, but I'll stick with what initially occurred to me, not least because I am sort of annexing all the rabbit holes on this episode, and Liam probably has rabbit holes of his own that he wants to get a word in edgeways. He's got a whole pad, so as far as I'm concerned, like I'm vindicated at this point. But I was also curious about what you were saying about performative patriotism. Things like signing various documents and all the rest of it. And at what point do um do people start commenting on women overstepping in terms of going beyond um, represent beyond doing something that can be categorized as female patriotism and instead doing something that's overtly political, which would then have been frowned upon and seen as sort of detrimental and subversive and all the rest of it. And how do women try and navigate that? Because this was one of my other follow-ups, which is in terms of you talking about sort of these women doing a lot of these expressions of patriotism through a feminine lens. Is that because, and I suspect the answer to this will be, well, it's a bit of both, but is that because these women are recognizing that the way in which they garner some agency um, is to play men at their own game and to conform to that norm, but inherently can therefore express themselves and perhaps push back against some of these things? Or is it that those are the strictures of society and there isn't really an opportunity to step beyond those without drawing a huge amount of ire from men and therefore sort of having those points that they're trying to make dismissed out of hand because of the latent misogyny?
I mean, yes to both of those, but I suspect also there's at least a third thing going on, which is that women are not always trying to change the setup and are not always trying to do anything other than give a bit of money to the war effort or sign a petition to say we think this is a good thing or we don't think this is a good thing. Very often the subscription lists are nicely hierarchical. So you will have the husband giving a shilling and the wife giving half a shilling, and the children get tuppences each to add. And that's all just very nicely hierarchical. But how do you know if women are doing that for any of these reasons? I mean, Samuel Johnson famously said that one never has any idea why somebody signs a petition. Is it just to hack off an employer who doesn't want him to sign it? Is it to show he can sign his name? Or is it because he believes heart and soul in this thing and wants to support it? It's very difficult to know why people did things. And I suppose in a way I have called that performative patriotism, or we have collectively, as a discipline, talked about female patriotism. And these are the things that are open to women. And I wonder actually if we do these women a bit of a disservice, if we see virtually anything with power involved in it, which is most of human life, as political, then actually, why should they not have been sewing and knitting and, seeing these things as significant contributions, and so on. So, yeah, I'm sure there were women who were frustrated that that was all they could do, that they would have liked to have been giving speeches and they would have liked to have been writing and so on. But I imagine probably that an awful lot of women just went along with what was going on because this is what everybody was doing. That feels a bit denying the sisterhood there, doesn't it? But yeah, all of the above.
Thanks, Emma. Now I've managed to wrestle the mic out from the clutches of the king of rabbit holes. I kind of wanted to go back again, and you mentioned about there is clearly the numbers of men in uniform is huge, and the amount of women that were then left to run households, estates, businesses, and that's right across the social spectrum, right? Is there any recognition at the time for these women in terms of maybe access to services because they're part of the war effort in that sense? Do they get any extra kind of kudos in the community? And yeah, what does that look like across the sort of the class structure?
I,
And
I, I sorry, I was just going to say, I don't think we talk about this enough. So I'm not particularly helpful on this. I can mention one thing that I think is really interesting. I'm sorry, I'm conscious that I interrupted you, so come back with the rest of the question. But I was fascinated to find out that there's a brilliant article by Patricia Lynn on the kind of establishment of, or the development of welfare in England during the 1790s for soldiers' families. I came across in the National Records of Scotland vouchers that were given to women whose husbands went off on militia service in the Napoleonic Wars. So they knew fine well that they might not be just operating in their counties, that they were they were signing up at the height of the invasion scare, and they were, liable to be sent elsewhere in the country. So these were chits that were given to women, and they were to write down their own name and also the full name and exact age of all their children, have it countersigned by their church minister or by a magistrate, and then they would get extra money to help them cope while dad is away serving. And that's really interesting, I think. I think what that says about citizenship and a sense of what is being contributed not only by a man going off to serve, but by his family left behind. And the state both saying, okay, maybe there's a joint responsibility to look after you because of what you are sacrificing, but also we would like to make sure that you're the kind of person that we are happy to sponsor by having your church minister or a magistrate sign your chit. I think that's quite an interesting interplay between the state and the citizen there. So I think that's maybe an instance of what you're talking about. But my broader answer is that this is a line that I threw out quite easily to classes, which is, why do we talk about this with the First World War, and why is this such a big deal in the 20th century? But it must have been going on in the 18th century, but we just don't really talk about it as far as I am aware. And again, very open to being corrected on that.
I wanted to sort of follow up the last part of that question with, if if any of that did happen, which I guess it sort of did and it didn't. Do we see any evidence of women pushing for more rights? Early feminism, perhaps, or does the sort of, is this when the seeds planted, or I mean, I think it's much later, but
Yeah, no, it's a good conversation to have, because Wollstonecraft follows up her Vindications of the Rights of Men, which was pushed out very quickly in answer to Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. She and Catherine Macaulay both hit the press on the same day, 29th of November, 1790. They're out off the starting blocks first, but she follows that up less than 2 years later with her Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is really, it's not the earliest piece of feminist writing, but it's the first fully fledged feminist treatise in English. So absolutely, this is important. And there are women who are really conscious of women's rights, inspired by the French Revolution, for sure, inspired by French feminists like Olympe de Gouges, who wrote a Declaration of the Rights of the Citizen, which was absolutely inclusive of women as well as of men. And there are men as well. There's a brilliant book by Ariane Chernock called Men in the Making of Modern British Feminism, which actually is all about the 1790s and about men who supported women's rights from a very broad brush. We think they should be educated, through, well, we think we ought to be publishing them, right through to a very much smaller number who say they should get the vote. So I think this is an important period, but the caveat is that it is clamped down upon very, very quickly, just as happened in France. So really from 1793 onwards, women are thrown out of the Jacobin clubs. And once we get to Napoleon, women's rights don't stand an awful lot of chance, do they? So that happens in France, but equally, it's part of the backlash in Britain is for the socially conservative large majority in society to say, well, the French allowed women to be involved in their revolutionary political clubs, and look what happened there. This is a good reason why we should not be doing anything in favour of women here. In fact, I think Wollstonecraft herself doesn't suffer utter cancellation until her husband, William Godwin, who loved her very much, published an unfortunate memoir and repeated unfortunate things about her life, which allowed the Conservatives then again to say, well, this is who a feminist is, and therefore run far away from feminism. So the backlash comes in very hard and very early. My theory, and it is very much only a theory, is that if you open a door on something to people and you show them what's inside, even when you shut that door again very fast, the desire is increased. So it's not surprising that, okay, it takes a few decades because the backlash is hard and fast, but actually it's not that long before proper campaigns for women's rights come in. You get the odd one or two in the 1810s. You've got Chartists, anti-Corn Law League people, individual pockets up and down the country before the mid-19th century of people looking for political rights for women, never mind educational rights and kind of easier social rights to swallow. But I think that's important, that once you start saying, even before Wollstonecraft, when people are beginning to think about women through various works of Enlightenment philosophy, they never go quite as far as she does, but the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers do discuss the nature of gender and the nature of women. And then you get Wollstonecraft coming in and saying, actually, we need to have equal citizenship in the home. This is where it needs to start, at the root of society. Once you give people a glimpse of that and then take it away again, I think probably the desire is increased.
I mean, that is an absolute winner of a point, I think, to end on. It is extremely difficult to get the cat back in the bag. Dr. Emma Macleod, thank you so much. I mean, what an absolute gem of an episode. And I am already absolutely looking forward to part 2, where I'm sure we will get to some of the questions that we had planned in amongst all the rest of it. Like I said, thanks very much, Dr. Emma Macleod, a senior lecturer in history at the University of Stirling. She is the author of A War of Ideas, British Attitudes to the Wars Against Revolutionary France. Wow. Thank you so much for listening. And the Napoleonic Wars podcast will be back very soon.
Folks, as the festive season approaches, consider whether you'd be willing to do any of these things to spread the Napoleonic cheer. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Then sign up to our newsletter by contacting us at napwarspod@gmail.com and get the regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a novel Christmas gift for the Napoleonicist in your life? Check out our merch via the link in the description in order to support our work while giving your loved ones something distinctive this winter. If you aren't in a position where you can dig into your pockets, then believe me, we totally get it. But that doesn't mean that you can't thank us for the episodes that you've enjoyed in a different way. All podcast platforms have ways for you to leave your reviews, so just spare us 2 minutes and leave a review wherever you listen to us. It makes a world of difference in boosting our international ranking and widening our reach. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and develop new exciting documentary channels. So if you want to be kept entertained on a daily basis when it comes to Napoleonic nerdery, prices start from just £2 a month. And if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late October, are in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and the enigmatically named Zed. The Chiefs of Staff: that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire, Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.